intervals. It's the distance between two notes, and we can have more than two notes that would have intervals between them. But intervals, as I've talked about before, being one of the foundations of music. Music is built of intervals and chords. What is it about these intervals that gives them their incredibly unique and individual qualities? To me, a perfect fifth has this unbelievable, placid, yet rich and interesting sound, very open. What is it about the fifth that makes it sound this way? It's clearly two notes, right in the middle of an octave. We go up to the octave, and an octave is another one. An octave is the same note repeated double the speed and frequency, and we hear it as the same note twice, one higher and one lower. So that's a very interesting thing, the same note, but with a fifth, it's two notes. What is it about those that makes them sound so great and unique, and all the other intervals as well? Well, to try and explore a way to understand the characters of intervals and their inner nature, let's try seeing sound. Maybe we could look at the vibrations of intervals as they move through the air and turn those vibrations from sound waves into light waves, into pulsations of light, and slow them down so we can see the patterns that the intervals make as they move through the air, but slowed down into a realm where we can perceive it and turn it into pulsations of light so we'll be able to see the sound, see the interval. And maybe that'll help us gain some illumination into their nature and their character. Let's take a look. So let's begin the journey to turn the character of intervals, their nature in sound, into something visual that might help us understand them even better. So this is a little software program that I created to show the intervals visually. So what we have here is an octave. We have the fundamental down here in red and the octave above also in red. And I made it so they light up when you play it. I made a little keyboard player here on my computer keyboard, and I do the octave and we get that. So we hear clearly that's an octave. And as we know, an octave is simply vibrating twice as fast as the fundamental. So if we use 100 hertz just as an example for the fundamental, then the octave would be vibrating at 200 hertz. Now, we're going to look at octaves and fifths a lot, as well as a few other intervals, but let's toss in the fifth just transparent to see it. So we divide up the octave into fundamental, fifth, and octave. Now, the fifth is exactly halfway in frequency between the fundamental and the octave. Now, it's halfway in frequency, but as you see here, it's looking like it's a little higher up. It is because we have a perspective here in 3D. Essentially what I've done is make all the pitches be slices of a cube. Now I've stretched it out a little bit, so it's more of a rectangle this way, but just for visual clarity. But if we were looking directly at the plane in front, the one that's right in the middle, which would be this one, that's what we'd see as a line. But the fifth is actually a little bit higher up. Now this is strange because the fifth is right in the middle in terms of frequency. If this is 100, that would be 150, and that would be 200, right in the middle. But we don't hear it that way. We hear it a little differently. We hear a fifth being how many notes, how many half steps above the fundamental. What's a fundamental? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 half steps above. And then from the fifth, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we only have 5 half steps between the fifth and the octave, and we have 7 half steps between the fundamental and the fifth. So this is something kind of mysterious that we don't hear the fifth is in the center when it's actually in the center. Now, the reason is because we hear sound by the natural logarithm. And I'll give a brief and not too technical explanation, but I think it's very interesting, so I want to go into this a little bit. It helps, I think, your appreciation and understanding of what's going on when we discern the inner nature of intervals. because it's related to this. Now, if we look here, the major diatonic pitches in 3 octaves. So here we've got octave 1, and the second octave, as you see, gets bigger and bigger. Actually, let me go to this. Okay. Here, as you see, we've got 3 octaves represented by frequency. So the first octave here, it would be like 100 to 200, for example. Then 200 would have to go to 400, and sure enough, it's, twice as big. Then 400 to 800 is twice again as big. So the frequencies spread out. And the fifth, as you see, is exactly in the center of each octave, the fifth being the blue line. It's right there in the middle. And fifth here between this octave right in the middle, and so on. But as I said, that's not the way we hear. We hear by the natural logarithm. And if I display that, there's the linear way the frequencies are that I just displayed for you. And the natural log is how we hear. As you see now, the fifth is higher because there's more notes below it than there are above it between the octave. And every octave appears the same to us, to our ear. We just hear each octave as the same note an octave higher, but it doesn't seem like it's screamingly getting farther and farther away from the previous octave as it does in a linear sense. So we hear by the natural log. Now let's take a look at what that really means just briefly. I have some graphing software here graphing the harmonic series. And that harmonic series essentially is just y equals 1 over x. And you can see it. So if here's 1 for x, this is the x line, x coordinate. 1 over 1 is 1, and sure enough, y, which is the vertical direction, is 1. And if we go to 2, okay, x is 2, and y equals 1 over x. So 1 over 2 is 1/2, and sure enough, there's the 0.5 right here. The y is on the 0.5 line. Now this curve goes to infinity, and it makes the harmonic series. It never really reaches 0, but it gets closer and closer. Now, this is a very mysterious and beautiful curve because it seems to be essential to the nature of reality. Not only is music derived from this and sound, the harmonic series, but so is the natural logarithm, and that's the way we perceive music and sound. And prime numbers are embedded in there also, but that's another story. In a sense, there is a relation to it with the zeta function, but we won't go there. So what I wanted to show you very briefly is how we can find the natural log way we hear represented right here. So the natural log is essentially just the area under the curve. So you take any number starting at 1, and you go up to any number you want. If you go 1 to 2, and you take the area under this curve at the harmonic series, that gives you the natural logarithm. So for example, if I did do that, say I integrate. So we get the curve. I got the keyboard on, so you're going to hear little beeps when I push keys. So we integrate. That's funny. Integrate to give us the area. Now, so we don't have to do the calculus ourselves right here because the graphing program will integrate for us. So, and it shows us here the integrated area from 1 to 2, and the area that's shown in red is 0.6931, and that's the natural log of 2. All right, now here's how this works with hearing. So if we integrate again here, I'll integrate the fifth, which is 3 to 2, which if we divide 3 by 2, we get 1.5. So I'll integrate that. And here we see 1 to 1.5. So we've integrated that. And we get an area of right here, 0.4055, just, truncate a little bit just to 4 decimal points. Now, let's multiply that times 2. Okay, that gives us a much bigger number than the logarithm of 2. That was 0.69. So this is 0.8. So that's much bigger. We can see that when we have the right there, 0.6931. So this is not the same. It doesn't work that way where the fifth is halfway between. And you can see here why. Because here's where the fifth sounds in terms of frequency, but if we look at the curve going up, there's clearly more area here for the fifth than there is on the other side going up to the octave. This is much less area because the curve is declining. So where is the exact midpoint? turns out the exact midpoint of an octave in terms of the way we hear it is the square root of 2, which is a tritone. So I'll enter, the square root of 2 in here. And there we get a number right here. This is the integrated number for the square root of 2. So natural log square root of 2. And that gives us, if we, copy that and multiply this times 2. And that should be this natural logarithm of 2. And it is 0.6931, this said, but of course we're kind of rounding off. So that is the natural logarithm of 2, which shows us that this area here for the square root of 2, the tritone, which would be like C to F sharp, that's an example of a tritone or a diminished fifth. That area in yellow is the same as this area here in red. And that's how we hear in terms of natural logarithm. So looking at the visualizer again, we have each chromatic tone represented by how we hear it in terms of the distance between octaves. I can even go up a little bit. So each half step between is the same exact distance apart as we hear it, even though the frequencies, they actually get bigger and bigger between each of those half steps. All right, so we can kind of get an idea how intervals look in terms of the way we hear it with the natural log. So there's a fourth, and there's a fifth, and that's a major third, minor third, second, half step, and root. So we can do chords, we can kind of get a sense of that. Now that's all fun and interesting, but not terribly helpful. We can also add in little sandwich things. There's the third and the fourth added in, so we can kind of give ourselves reference points. So I said not very helpful, but it is helpful to help us begin to see this sort of distance between intervals. Like we always have to keep 5 in our mind in relation to a fundamental. It's like 1, 5, 1. These are the really foundational parts of an octave in the diatonic series here, like a scale. If we can keep those in our mind, we can orient ourselves with all the other pitches by comparing them. So we have to remember always when we're in a key, if this is the key, we have to remember what 5 sounds like. So 1, 5, we have to really remember that pitch. And we can see it there right in the middle, essentially. I'm going to call it the middle, even though we hear a little higher, but they're the simplest ratios. An octave is 2 to 1, and a fifth is 3 to 2. So these are the simplest. The other intervals become more complex. A fourth is 4 to 3 in ratio, and a major third is 5 to 4, a minor third is 6 to 5, and a major second would be 9 to 8. Those kinds of things. And the tritone that we mentioned would be 1 over the square root of 2, which is pretty strange. Okay, or square root of 2 over 1, rather. All right. What we need to do is to see what happens when we play 2 notes together. And we're dealing with sine waves. So here we have a sine wave that's the fundamental. That'll be our reference pitch in the other diagram. And the fundamental can be any pitch you want. We were saying 100 hertz because it's easy to think in multiples or fractions of 100. And the octave, if this is 100 hertz, for example, would be twice as fast, or 200 hertz. And you can see the waveform is moving twice as fast. There's 2 peaks here when there's 1 peak there. Now, what happens in reality, if we play 2 sine waves that are an octave apart, 2 sine waves don't move through the air really. What happens is that they sum. For example, if you pluck a guitar string and it's making these 2 pitches, you'd have a summed version, a composite waveform. And what happens is they interfere both destructively and constructively. When the peaks coincide more or less, you see you get a higher peak here. And when the troughs more or less coincide, you get a destructive interference, which drops down. So you get this more complex pattern. And you notice that the ratio of an octave is 2 to 1, and the upper number 2 gives us how many peaks we're going to get, and this waveform continues to repeat in this pattern. So that's what's really happening when we play an octave, at least if it's made of sine waves. We get this pattern that's moving through the air. Now, I made this pulsing ability where we take the what's happening with an interval, like the octave in this case. So I show you here, this is what's repeating. This is the pattern that would repeat. This is the length of the actual waveform, and then it just repeats over and over. So this happens in the air in terms of compression and rarefaction as the sound waves moves through the air. But I wanted to make an equivalent that was visual and that uses light to illustrate the waveform. So the peaks would be an increase in brightness, and the troughs would be a decrease in brightness, and this would be down to darkness. So I add this pulsing kind of feature here, and here first, if I play the fundamental, there it is pulsing in this sine wave. That'd be the reference pitch. So it's when it's bright, it's the top. When it's dark, it's at the bottom, and so on, like this. Is following the waveform. And if we do the octave, it's doing the same thing twice as fast. So we can see that it's just doing the sine wave. But if we put them together, now you'll notice that it's actually doing this waveform. It goes from bright to less bright, off, bright to less bright, following these peaks exactly. So this is really interesting for me. It's giving us a visual representation of what's actually happening with the interval. And we can move it up in speed to get a sense of what it seems to be doing. You know, actually, in reality, it's happening very fast in the air, right? If it's 100 hertz, which is quite a low note, actually, that'd be pulsing like that 100 times a second. And, you know, if you have 1,000 hertz sine wave, 1,000 times a second. So we're slowing it down, putting it in a realm where we can perceive it. But the idea is this visual explanation of what's happening in sound might help us understand the actual character of an interval. And here we have that kind of purity and clarity of an octave, which is essentially the same pitch. We hear that familial relationship of the same note. And that's what an octave looks like. Now we can go on and do this with other intervals as well. So we can do this kind of thing for any interval we want. Now let's look at a fifth. Fifth's the next most simple interval. It's 3 to 2. So we have a reference pitch, and then we have essentially a pitch that's 1.5 times above it. And here's the way they interfere with each other. We have 3 peaks. So you notice the top number sort of gives you the number of peaks. Octave is 2 to 1. We have essentially 2 peaks in the pattern. The perfect fifth is 3 to 2. We have a pattern of little 3 mountains there. So bright, down to not quite off, and then gets a little brighter, down a little bit, not as bright as over here, and then down to nothing. So this is the pattern we should see when we do a fifth. And it is, exactly. So that gives us an idea visually of what a perfect fifth does with sound waves. So just fun to give us a sense of learning the character of these intervals, getting to know them. And this is just a kind of a fun way, synesthetically, to try and experience sound by sight. So crank it up a bit more, really get a sense of the pulsing. So that's a fifth. That's what a fifth is doing in the air. That's the sound it's making, or the character it has of the sound as it's moving through the air and hitting your eardrum. All right, then we look at a perfect fourth. Now we got, it's the ratio here is 4 to 3, and sure enough we have 1, 2, 3, 4 peaks. And let's take a look at a perfect fourth then. So, and that's the pattern we see. Let me slow it down a bit so you can catch it even more. So it's making that same pattern. If you follow it, it's repeating that waveform in the box visually by brightness. So this is fun. And let's look at major third then. Major third is right here, and then there's a major third, and we have, this is a ratio 5 to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 peaks indeed, and there we can see it's making that pattern. And the last one I put in here is the minor third, and that's ratio 6 to 5, so you'd expect 6 peaks, and indeed we have it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 peaks. And let's take a look at a minor third. And that's the pattern it's making there, with light instead of sound. So fun. So let's speed them up and get a sense of how they look when they really flicker, just to get a sense of their character visually that we're hearing in the air. So minor third. The major third. Perfect fourth. Perfect fifth. An octave. Okay, so that's some fun with my visualizer and looking at the composite sum sine waves for intervals to give a sense of their nature as experienced in light instead of sound waves. So let's just experience this a little bit more. I'll improvise as best I can because I'm actually on a computer keyboard. It looks nothing like, of course, a piano keyboard, so it's hard to tell where the notes really are. But I'll leave the fifth on. I could turn it off, but it's nice to have the fifth as a reference pitch anytime we're in a key. And let's, I can use other intervals besides just having the fundamental in there. I can do more than 2 at a time. I can do clusters, and it shows you the actual pattern in light that the sound would be making in the air as a sound wave, the compression and rarefaction patterns that it would make. Now remember, I'm building all of these out of sine waves, so I've simplified it a little bit, but it gives you a good idea of the character of these intervals. So and there's some sound turned into light, so we can see the patterns that are happening way too fast for us to perceive, slowing them down enough so we can enjoy them as a visual display and perhaps help us understand a little bit more about the mystery of intervals.